This is the Enjoyer Podcast. I'm your host, James Dixon. I saw a commercial this morning that made me realize we're going to win. In the 2020s, women confessing that they hate their jobs is the closest we get anymore to damsels in distress. On TikTok, this is basically an entire genre of video. The obvious point is usually what you hear in response, especially on the conservative side, that this is to be expected, that this is what happens when we force women into the workforce and outside their nature, that this is what happens when girl boss dreams run into the harsh realities of the world. This is the world of work that we used to protect women from, and now we force them into it. It's a problem of values and design. To an extent, those things are all true. We really do push people into realms and stations in life and positions in life that they don't really want, even if they appear to be asking for them. It really is a problem of design. But women working is not the problem. Look, I have a rule about these things. I don't talk about stuff that's never going to happen. I have no problem being wrong. You guys have heard me be wrong. I said Biden was going to be the Democratic nominee in November. Okay? I'm wrong all the time. But I have a big problem wasting my time on things that will only fail and are planned to fail. So whenever I see guys talk about longing for the days of a single-sex workforce, talking about we need to repeal the 19th Amendment, I don't see strident, hard talk. I don't see masculinity. I see men who've given up. I see men who don't believe they can win now and today and here. They don't think they can subvert the rule book or tilt the playing field. So instead, they retreat to the treehouse of their mind, the only boys' club that can't be invaded. They sit in a hammock and they dream about rolling the clock back to the 1990s, or maybe the 50s, or maybe the world before there were Rosie the Riveters on the job. Part of this is our conservative wiring. We respect tradition and what came before us. We don't oppose change just because it represents change, but we don't jump in headlong either. We have several questions first. Chief among them, are we improving things or just changing them? On the left, they view it differently. In 1992, when Bill Clinton was running for president, his theme song said, "Don't stop thinking about tomorrow. Don't stop, it'll soon be here. It'll be even better than before. Yesterday's gone. Yesterday's gone." This was the progressive impulse at its best and most harmless. At the other extreme, these are the people who pull down statues by law and tear down others by force. But all of them are speaking the same mantra. Yesterday's gone. Yesterday's gone. And what I need you to understand is that when it comes to the workforce, the single-sex workforce, yesterday's gone, guys. There's no more two-tier systems in America where black is treated different than white or woman is treated different than man. It's not legal. It's not constitutional. It's not allowed. It's not a thing. So either the system works for you and me and Rosie the Riveter, the would-be girl boss, or it doesn't work for anyone. It should be clear to you by now, looking around at life in 2024, that it doesn't work for anyone. So back to what makes me think we'll win. It's a 90-second ad that's been making the rounds. I saw it on Twitter. It shows a pretty young woman, the demographic of all those TikTok videos, living the gig job existence. She's working at call centers. She's working in food delivery. She's shooting influencer videos while doing food deliveries. Her phone pings constantly, but it's never with good news. She's crushed by the weight of expectation. Everybody in her phone wants and needs something from her. After scaling an impossibly high building, one guy gives her a 78-cent tip. Just about the only thing she doesn't try is to start an OnlyFans, much to her credit. Finally, she's making a drop-off at a factory, just as other women are leaving the factory. She asks them, "What do you do?" And that question opens the door to a new life. Inside the factory, they work jobs, not gigs. Inside the factory, they work on a contract, not tipped wages. Inside the factory, the dignity of work compares well to the indignity of the gig economy. So there will be women in the workplace, perhaps even your wife and daughter. The question is not how do we send them all home. We can't, we won't, and we're adult enough to know that. The question is, what's our plan to make Detroit great again? See, what I saw in that commercial is that the Detroit lifestyle, the things that made us rich and powerful when we were rich and powerful, happened inside that factory. That is where many a person struggling to make ends meet on their own found the stable life they were looking for. Like I said before, my grandfather came up from Louisiana to Metro Detroit. This was, 80 years ago? Who does that? Who does that for a job unless it's one hell of a job? Well, it was one hell of a job. What I saw in that commercial is that we need to bring back the job economy as the backbone of America. And the gig economy needs to be what it was 10 years ago. More of an add-on, more of a, hey, if you're on the Dave Ramsey plan and trying to run through a bunch of debt, yeah, maybe you do a little bit of Uber. I don't think the thought was ever that mass amounts of people would be doing this as their job or even in addition to their full-time jobs just to make ends meet. Things aren't working, obviously. People are working their asses off, actually, and it's not doing them much good. It's clear from that commercial that we're gigging ourselves to death. But the commercial ends by pointing us to a better way, to the Detroit way. And in Michigan, a better future will look a lot like the glory days of our past. To make Detroit great again, we must make Detroit build again. But first, we have to dispense with an idea that's holding us back big time. It's popular among politicians in Michigan, like Governor Gretchen Whitmer, which means it's also popular among her repeaters in the Lansing media. None of them can say this, so I will. I have permission. I got it this morning, actually. The laptop economy, the knowledge economy won't save Michigan. Michigan does not need and will not attract the jobs of the future. We've talked before about how it went when Detroit tried to attract the Amazon 2 headquarters. We were willing to pretty much give away our kids' school money for the next 30 years to attract Jeff Bezos and 50,000 people who could live anywhere in the world. We didn't get it. Instead, we got a few more fulfillment centers. Don't go chasing waterfalls. Stick to the rivers and lakes you're used to. We don't need the laptop economy. We need to bring back the jobs of the past. And look, I know what I said earlier. Yesterday's gone, right? And where that applies to half of humanity partaking in the workforce, that's absolutely true. Forget changing that. But when the question is, who should be the manufacturer to the world? Well, that can change. And within our lifetime, it has, and it moved in the wrong direction. The first time I remember getting in trouble at school, I was in 4th grade. I come from a family that loves to watch the news. I was 9 and 10 in the 4th grade, and I didn't much like watching the news, but didn't have much of a choice either. Unlike today, I didn't have my own smartphone and earbuds and my own little world. Back then, we had one TV in the living room, and we all watched the same thing as a family. So what little I did watch of the news and what little I did understand, I knew a lot of the talk was out about this bill called NAFTA. I wasn't sure what it did. Based on what the local news was saying and what I could pick up from my parents, I knew it wouldn't be good for Detroit. When that bill was in its latter stages, I interrupted a lesson in my 4th grade class with the question. In my mind's eye, I wasn't being disruptive. In fairness, I can't remember the details, but in fairness to myself, it was probably prompted by something the teacher said. It might have been tangential, but it was connected to the main body. I don't think it just came out of nowhere. My questions were, 1, did NAFTA pass? And 2, is there a TV in the teacher's lounge? Silly me. Here I was at school trying to get an education. Apparently that was the wrong thing to do. The teacher acted like I'd committed bloody murder in disrupting her precious lesson to ask a searching question that would have taken 10 seconds to answer. I never got my answer inside that classroom, and so I learned to look for answers outside of it. I didn't know then what a favor my teacher was doing for me. If she knew it, she probably wouldn't have done it. Naturally, the bill did pass and was signed into law by President Bill Clinton, a Democrat. When I learned what NAFTA did, I would also come to understand what Ross Perot meant back in 1992 when he talked about that giant sucking sound. That was the sound of all the industrial jobs that made Michigan rich leaving America for Mexico and other parts south of the border. In 2001, just months after 9/11, America doubled down on its mission to send away its jobs. China was allowed to join the World Trade Organization. In 1989, China was as rich as Egypt, which is to say it was poor. Today, its per capita economy is behind only America. It was America that created China as manufacturer to the world, and it happened because it benefited the donors and golf buddies of politicians. So whether it's NAFTA, Whether it's China joining the World Trade Organization, whether it's Republicans or whether it's Democrats, pretty much everyone in the American ruling class proved eager to send away our jobs, the backbone, the middle class. Around the turn of the century, there was actually a belief that doing more business with America would make countries like China act more like America, that our standards and liberalism would liberate and liberalize China, that the flood of cheap Chinese goods would then also in America reduce the pressure on household budgets. It was supposed to work in both directions. America was supposed to make China more liberal. China was supposed to make America more affordable. But now, all these years later, the error of our ways is obvious. I'm 40 and I've often lamented the adult lives, the tragic adult lives, that should say, of the elderly millennial. All my life, I grew up in a town, Detroit, where people who worked with their hands could afford homes, second homes, college educations. In Detroit, the distinction between white collar and blue collar mattered less than anywhere else on earth. Didn't matter what collar you wore. Everybody was making a good living if you had a job. My first year of high school, the seniors were in the class of 1999. I still remember one of those seniors saying, in a eureka moment one day, it happened all at once as we were sitting there in accounting one, that if he doesn't get a college scholarship to play baseball, he's not going to college. He had an uncle who worked at a Ford plant and could get him in the union. 25 years later, I have no doubt he's making Ford F-150s by day and driving them by night. But just a few years later, by the time I graduated in the class of 2002, nobody was talking that way. So this change was all set in motion in my childhood. They pulled up the streets of gold between 9/11 and when I turned 18. This may have benefited a few people who own large industrial concerns, and it may have seemed even here and there to benefit us. Look how much cheap Chinese crap you can get at Walmart these days. It's not a coincidence that we hardly expect quality in the things we buy anymore. Nothing sold cheaply needs to last. You can just keep buying more. But every time we do this, every time we buy more and get less, we're complicit in our own ruin. That's true for all Americans, but it's truest in Michigan. Manufacturing is our heritage, and it's at risk. Later in the show, you'll hear from OW Root, one of our writers at Enjoyer.com. OW is an expert, I would say, on the finer things in Michigan. He lives up in Petoskey, a setting that's every bit identified with the Michigan lifestyle as the factories of Detroit. OW says the easiest way to spot tourists from downstate: look for the herds of bros traveling together in packs. When you see 3 or 4 young, able-bodied men together at a grocery store, shopping cart full of beer and booze, you know immediately they ain't from here. But let's talk about what those bros are escaping from when they go up north. It might not be a factory anymore, but it is the grind. The factory you work or the jail you guard might demand your time for 16 hours a day. A top law firm in Detroit will demand at least 14 a day. Teachers get summers off, but they have to deal with the children left behind all the rest of the year. You can take a job like that, or you can gig yourself to death like young Rosie. But there ain't no easy way out. In Genesis 3, after Adam and Eve eat the forbidden fruit, work is assigned to mankind as a curse. So whenever a kid asks, why does dad leave every day to go to work? Or why does my older sister go to school every day? All of that traces back to Genesis 3. We are all forced outside of our house, outside of our family settings, to go learn from the world, to go bring back money, to become a real person, to become a contributor. Because just like God told Adam in creation, it's not good that you be alone. We need each other, and we're meant for each other. So in a sense, work is our curse. It's inescapable. All that's left then is to argue the terms of the work. And what I find inarguable in 2024 is that Detroit and Michigan are better off when we build things. A viable Detroit is the tide that lifts all boats in Michigan. If Detroit is an idea and not just a place, that idea is hard work. Here in Michigan, we work to live. A place like Washington, D.C. or New York, they live to work. They love to hop out of bed at midnight because they got a call from the boss. That's generally not how we roll here. We'll give you our 8 hours. We'll give you our 12 hours or our 16 hours, but work is never where our heart will be as Michiganders. Our hearts are at home. Yeah, we earn our dollars grinding. We find the work regular and stable, even if it is demanding. But we do it for one reason. We do it to build a life of love and to build memories with the people we love. The problem with young Rosie is she was trapped in the worst of all worlds. She has no job, but she's never not working. She has no office and no corporate ladder to climb. She has no coworkers to learn from, no mentors to show her the ropes, no mentees to ease them into the culture. No one's invested in young Rosie and her well being, and she's not invested in anyone else either. She's all alone. It's the last place any of us wants to see a pretty young girl. The woman leaving the factory faced the same life pressures that Rosie does. Will I make enough money to buy a home? Will I ever find a partner in life and have a family? We just talked about it. Before Eve was created, the only thing in creation God described as not good was Adam being alone. Do you think you're better off alone? If so, you couldn't be more wrong. God's already spoken on this. But in that work setting, with a real job, a real wage, and a real team, young Rosie wouldn't be alone. At least half of her working hours. We know she knows how to work hard. The gig economy at least taught her that much. But teams help us make work meaningful again. Unfortunately, the biggest threat to our industrial revival holds all the gavels in Lansing. They're the Michigan Democrats. Last year, they passed a radical energy policy into law. In 2040, by 2040, the Michigan utilities that you and I rely on, the DTEs and consumers, will run largely on solar panels and wind turbines. Stellantis, now occupying the Chrysler spot in the Big Three, recently paid a $190 million fine for violating emission standards. It has another fine on deck of about $500 million. Last year, around the holidays, Stellantis laid off workers at an auto factory in Detroit and another one in Ohio. When the company explained itself, it cited the need to manage sales and avoid more problems with California air quality regulators. So already, California energy policy is costing our neighbors their jobs, their livelihoods, their holidays. And now Michigan has plans to go down that same path? Then there's the union factor. Look, I've been a union member before. I was proud to join the union as a Detroit News reporter. My thought was that since I get all the benefits of union coverage, I might as well pay for services rendered. Seemed fair. I don't have a problem with unions. I have a problem with union bosses, like UAW President Shawn Fain. While you and I are trying to feed our families and survive inflation, Shawn Fain has delusions of grandeur. Fain has plans to launch a global general strike starting on May 1st, 2028. He timed the UAW contracts with Ford, GM, and Stellantis to expire on April 30th of that year for max effect. He's trying to build a movement among his union brothers that they do the same. Fortunately for us, Shawn Fain is under investigation right now by a federal monitor that's been placed to weed out corruption in the traditionally and chronically corrupt UAW. That investigation might ultimately unravel his credibility and hold off a global disaster scenario. So why is it then that when Shawn Fain of the UAW has become his most reckless, Michigan Democrats have tied our workers to his union? When Michigan's right-to-work repeal took effect in February, it again made it a job condition for factory employees at the Big Three to maintain UAW membership. After a decade of free choice, now workers had no voice. This was done to them by the Democrats who run Lansing. It wasn't done for them. The very next week after right-to-work repeal took effect, Fain announced a $40 million three-year campaign to spread the UAW footprint to the American South. It appears that the Democrats who run Michigan fell for the okie doke. And now time is of the essence. Shawn Fain has basically made the UAW contract a ticking time bomb. Michigan losing right-to-work status means that our workers and the companies that hire those workers are strapped to that bomb too. If you're Bill Ford or Mary Barra at GM or whoever runs Stellantis these days and you have to open up a new plant, do you do this in Michigan? Do you force yourself to deal with Shawn Fain because that's what Henry Ford would have done? Or do you open it someplace without the UAW? And then when the UAW tries to get started, you tell workers in those places why those jobs aren't going to Michigan and why they wouldn't come here either if the company was forced to negotiate with the socialists. So our path forward is simple, but it's not easy. The reason Chinese goods are cheap, even with global shipping, is because worker pay is so low. It's our value system that's wrong. We think it's great that we have cheap stuff, but we hate that we don't get real raises. We don't see it, but the two factors are directly related. Think back 4 years ago. The media tells us we need ventilators for COVID. We need them yesterday. If you had a family member who needed a vent, would you rather it be built in China by our avowed and stated arch rival or by your neighbors here in Detroit? Whose work do you trust? Whose quality do you trust? More importantly, whose prosperity do you benefit from? You want your neighbor to have that job. The post-COVID world should be Detroit's time to rise. After 30 years of the giant sucking sound, after yet another reminder that Detroit is always there for America in its moment of need, we should see this clearly. My question is, who's going to stand up as our champion? And unfortunately, we do need one in politics. It's not enough that Bill Ford wants to keep jobs local. Unless the political winds blow in that direction, the jobs will continue to leave. J.D. Vance, Donald Trump's candidate for vice president, he's talked a lot about industrial policy, and he probably will talk a lot about it this fall as he visits Michigan. We're going to be a battleground state. The whole world's going to be watching. Gretchen Whitmer's even done a little bit of lip service herself, but it's actually Whitmer that shows kind of the limits of the lip service. Whitmer's talked about the need to reindustrialize Michigan, and what she did is she brought in the World Economic Forum and Chinese companies. So that's not the stuff that's going to make Detroit great again. If we want to make America great again, that starts with making Detroit great again. What would make Detroit great again is making it build again. We were the king of manufacturing once. We could be and should be again. It's in all of our interest that we make Detroit build again. Don't take my word for it. Look at young Rosie. Look how happy she feels to finally be working a real job. My next guest is a talented writer and enjoyer of Michigan. My guest is O.W. Root, who is one of our most prolific writers on the Enjoyer site. You've heard his voice in some of these videos, especially talking about the takeover in Traverse City and how that once unique town has become just like every place else. O.W., thank you so much for joining us on the Enjoyer podcast.
Thanks for having me.
O.W., we'll start you with an easy one. What do you enjoy about Michigan?
Easy. The space and the nature, the waves, the lake. And, I live in northern Michigan. And so what I love about Michigan is the ability to get away from traffic and away from chaos. There's nothing more peaceful and really spiritually invigorating than sitting on the shore and listening to the waves. I mean, there is a spiritual connection there. And so that's what I love about Michigan.
Yeah. One of your pieces inspired a lot of talk in the Enjoyer community. This talk about where does northern Michigan begin? I'm a Southeast Michigan boy. My house is 2 miles north of Detroit. So I believe that when I'm on I-75 north and I'm no longer in Oakland County anymore, I am now up north. So Flint's up north, Saginaw's up, Midland, it might even include Lansing at that point. What is your demarcation of up north?
It's one of those things where we all have our own line. My argument, so a lot of people, I should say, would argue that I went too far south, that to include Grand Rapids and Holland is too far south. But this is my argument. My general argument is if you are being, and again, there's going to be exceptions to this, but if you're sort of in that Detroit range, it's not quite up north. You have to get out of that. And that's why the line is a little farther north on the east side, because Detroit is on the east side and it slopes down. And
Right.
If we think about it this way, Detroit and Ann Arbor, people say that Ann Arbor, Detroit. You hear people sort of say Ann Arbor, Detroit, and that means a certain thing. Grand Rapids, Holland also means a certain thing. And to me,
Right.
if you're going to split Michigan in two, if you have to, Grand Rapids and Holland have to be in one, and Ann Arbor, Detroit has to be in another. Grand Rapids and Holland has to be in the north, and Ann Arbor, Detroit obviously has to be in the south. And it's messy because, I would say you also have the deep north too. And I would say that this is where people start to say downstate. Because, you know, in Grand Rapids, people don't really say downstate. But once you get,
No?
I mean, to me, I hear it as people who are north of Manistee. That seems to be, you know, when people are Manistee say, oh, I'm going downstate, and that means Grand
Right.
Rapids, actually, you know? And
Right.
so I would almost argue that once you really start hearing downstate, that's kind of the deep north. And I feel like that's around Manistee or a little farther north. And so those real northerners would say, you went too south with Holland and Grand Rapids, but if you've got to make the line somewhere, that's my argument. That's one of my theories as to why.
Stupid question. Is the UP Northern Michigan or is the UP the UP?
You know what? I mean, this is a good question. I feel like, you know, the UP, it's its own entity. We have to call it its own entity. Yes, it might be part of Northern Michigan, but honestly, everybody just calls it the UP. You know, you call Northern Michigan Cadillac, you know, you call Petoskey or wherever Northern Michigan. If you're talking about the UP, you say the UP. If you're talking
Right.
about what is it, Houghton, you don't say it's in Northern Michigan. You say it's in the UP. You
Right.
know, you say it's in there. It's like how what is it? Like a Nissan is a car, but it's also a vehicle, but it's also, you know, it's like these it's more
The Venn
specific. Yeah,
diagrams.
exactly.
OW, you are rather well dressed today. Putting me to shame wearing the coat. You write quite a bit about fashion and these things.
Mhm.
I'd like to get your opinion. Fashion in the 2024 election. We know it's going to be Donald Trump on the Republican side. Looks like Kamala Harris. If you could, you know, just give us a few words on what you see as the aesthetic of the two candidates.
Pretty boring, to be honest. I mean, there's not much to say about Trump's aesthetic. It's kind of just, he doesn't do much. You know, he used to, because, you know, people back in the 80s and 90s, when they dress more formally, they'd have a little more fun. You know, I did a thread about this, or not a thread, a tweet yesterday about this. But when you look at politicians, congressmen, whatever, in the 80s or 90s, they actually they'd be a little more daring with ties and even what kind of suits they're wearing. You know, now if you really look, generally you'll see guys wearing solids and stripes, but that's really it. I did this tweet about Biden, actually, because he's been around for so long. You look at how Biden looked in the 80s and 90s, it really daring, actually. It really kind of dashing. But as we've moved forward, and in a certain sense, as formal wear has shrunk, it's almost become dour. You know, no one almost has fun with formal wear. If they're going to wear a suit, it's almost like a prison suit, essentially.
There's one with a picture where Biden has like a blue shirt with the white collar.
Yeah.
Only a business person would wear that kind of shirt now.
Yeah.
No politician would.
Oh, for sure. Or the red suspenders too. He's got one where he's wearing red suspenders. I mean, and he's got no jacket on as well. It's just so that era. And it's really interesting how it's just become so dour. And I think Europe, you might argue, is even worse. You know, if you look at European politicians, I don't think I've ever seen a European politician ever wear a non-dark tie. I mean, really, in the past 2 years, they're always, I mean, that's maybe an exaggeration, but they're always wearing navy suit, white shirt, and if it's a tie, just a dark tie. That's it. You never see that interesting, no motifs, no geometric, nothing interesting. And that's kind of, I think that actually gets to why people think of classic style as boring, is because the only classic style they see is boring. You know, they don't see that sort of debonair fun anymore, but there's so much fun you can have in classic style.
So you would say make fashion fun again.
Absolutely. Style should be fun. I write about style all the time. I write on my Substack, The Fitting Room. I write about it constantly. And yes, there's a lot of guidelines to consider, of course, but you shouldn't forget that it's about having fun as well. You should love your clothes. You know, you should love your clothes. And more formal clothing can be fun. I mean, what I'm wearing today, I'm wearing this sort of aqua blue butcher stripe. This is an interesting shirt. It's actually jovial. It's summer. It's fun, but it's actually more formal.
How did we get to this place? Where did the fun go?
Oh boy. You know, I think that what happened was we moved away from formality in dress. We moved away from sort of requiring guys to wear suits or requiring guys to wear jackets or shirts, whatever. And so then all the fun, all the personality, all of the excitement, all the personal style went to the informal wear, went to what you're wearing when you're informal. And then the formal wear, guys just sort of thought of as being like a prison suit or a prison uniform. I just have to wear it. It stinks. I don't like to wear it. It's unenjoyable. I feel uncomfortable. I mean, these are common things that guys sort of say. And so then they're like, why do I even try? Because there's no fun to be had. But once you make that step, and it's sort of a high learning curve. Yeah, it's a steep learning curve. But once you make that step, there's so much fun to be had there.
Yeah. OW, what's your Michigan story? How did you become an enjoyer of Michigan, a Michigan enjoyer?
That's a good question. You mean like where was I from in Michigan and all this? Like what?
Absolutely,
yeah.
Absolutely. And how'd you come to be up north? And the things you care about. I'm guessing you're a lettered man. I'm guessing you're a traveled man. That might not always be the typical neighbor you have up there.
For sure.
So yeah, just help us understand all that.
For sure. That's a good question. I grew up in West Michigan, a little south of Ludington. And so that's kind of getting up north. It's not quite to Manistee, but I still consider that West Michigan. Some people say West Michigan isn't that north, but I consider it West Michigan. And so, I mean, we're getting on to autistic details here. But yeah, I'm from West Michigan. I grew up on the lake, small town on the lake. And so I've always loved the lake. And I went to Western and I moved away. I traveled a bunch. I lived in Europe. I lived overseas. I lived in Chicago for a while. I lived in Milwaukee for a while as well. And my wife similarly also traveled overseas a lot. And she's also from Michigan, West Michigan as well. And we live in Northern Michigan because why don't we live in a city where we might see more people like us, where we might, and I don't even think that's necessarily, it is true in one sense, but it's not true in another sense, because the reason why we live up here is because it's beautiful, because it's, even in the winter, the winter is suicide inducing in Northern Michigan. It's true. We have to be honest. There's nothing to do. You might not make it. People, sometimes I would tweet about Michigan and I'd say, yeah, you can move up here, but you're probably not going to stay because you're going to leave when November comes around. Yeah. But there's even a beauty in that. There is that solitude, that severe darkness. It does something to you. And I think it's tough, but I think you get to experience so many highs and so many lows in Northern Michigan. And that's what I love about it. And we moved back here, you could say, rather than overseas or wherever, because we also want to be close to our parents, in addition to obviously loving Michigan. This is where we grew up, but our parents also live in West Michigan.
Any kids yet?
2.
Okay. How's that going? We hear about the schools. I've reported on the schools, just not a great situation overall. We weren't a smart state throughout our history. It's not what we've ever, based things around.
Yeah.
How does that go? And how do you go about giving your kid the advantages they'll need?
Good question. Well, our kids are quite young, but we aren't going to send them to school, homeschool. And so we're sort of
homeschool
in that whole zone,
Yes.
And so we're really into that whole thing. And being in Northern Michigan, that's another reason. I mean, it's great to raise kids here. They get to feel nature. They get to be around nature. My kids are outside all the time. They never use screens ever. They're perpetually, they look like, I have this picture of them from last summer. They look like they were in the Dust Bowl. They're like covered in dirt and whatever. And my kids are outside all the time. They are in the winter. We have extremely intense, balaclavas or whatever for them. They're outside constantly. And what we believe in terms of our education, in terms of the way we raise our kids, is try to be as natural as possible. And I mean that not in a sort of fake way, a trendy way. I mean that in experience the feeling of the seasons, experience outside and family, and try to feel creation as God created it to be.
It's funny. I learned to do that a few years ago because I used to have pretty bad seasonal depression, until one thing I did is I put up like one of those black, darkening things over the window. And I did that in the summer, but I kept it on. And what I learned is that it kind of created this casino feeling. And so if it's always kind of dark, I never need it to not be dark. And now that's just not even something I think about.
That's fascinating. That's fascinating.
And then I thought, okay, well, if it gets dark earlier, when it's dark and cold early, the world is literally telling you to go to bed early.
For sure.
Just go, take what the defense gives you, take what the seasons give you.
Yes.
And just follow that. Like, so when it's light until 9:30.
Mm-hmm.
I might not want to stay in the library all night. Maybe I need to be, doing something
Mm-hmm.
else. Just how do you learn to listen to your body and the seasons?
You know,
And yeah,
I so agree with you. I think that honestly, northern Michigan and being close to nature helps. The closer you are to that helps. And I also think trying to find, because this is the struggle, we have a hard time coming up with ways to enjoy it in the seasonal way. Meaning,
right,
yeah, we can't go to the beach, but you can if you wear the right clothes. There's this famous saying, there's no bad weather, just bad dressing. But if you wear the right clothes, you can walk outside even when it's 15 degrees and go for a walk and actually enjoy it. And I think that it's a struggle to enjoy the frigid tundra, but it is possible. And I think that it means not trying to shoehorn in those summer activities. Yeah, you're not going to be out frivolous and outward facing and happy. You're going to be a little more inward, but there's a lesson there. Just like there's a time for everything. There's a time for
right.
day, there's a time for night, a time for summer, a time for winter, and there's a time for everything. And that's
Growth and death and
yes,
renewal,
exactly.
and yeah.
Ecclesiastes, exactly. And so there's so much that we can. That's how I sort of think about things in terms of making peace with that.
You've written several stories for the Enjoyer at this point. Tell people about one of them.
Let me see. Which ones have we done? I'll tell you one that I love and that I think all up north people love, and people who live in the tourist places, are how to identify a tourist up north. I love that one because it's not like the most serious thing in the world, but it's everybody gets it. Everybody knows it. You can tell the tourist up north, and it's funny. We love the tourists in a way, and
Right. Love to see them come, love to watch them leave.
yes, exactly. And we've all been tourists. We're all tourists somewhere, wherever we go, right?
Oh yeah.
But it is that one I really love because what are some things that the tourist always does? Really bad sunburns. I talk about that. The tourist only has 3 days up north, so he gets scorched the first day and has to keep going back to the beach. Huge amounts of booze in a cart at Meyer, pushing it around. And there's a group of guys. You never see a group of guys in their 30s or 20s, whatever, shopping together with a ton of booze in Meyer.
Wow. It's kind of like in college. Like if you see a large group walking around, they're freshmen.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. It's like the same thing. They're not,
right.
If you see someone at Meyer, especially up north, because, there's not like colleges. There are, but it's not the same sort of thing. They're by themselves, they're with their kids or with their wife, but like a group of guys, 4 guys walking around stacking beer and all this stuff and liquor in a cart. $500 they're tourists.
Not a thing, huh?
No way. And yeah, you could say maybe you'll see 3 guys in the winter, but they're so obviously rural looking guys that you can tell they're local, and that's a real rare situation. Maybe they're in there at 6 getting some beer, but you can tell they're from here. It's hard to describe what that means, but you can tell. That's a classic tourist thing. They love buying tons of booze on the way into town. First night they get there, all of them in the cart.
Not to get too philosophical, but actually let's get rather philosophical. What do we make of this? You're escaping from life by vacationing.
Yes.
Then we need to escape from our own mind while on vacation.
It's like,
what is that?
It's almost like we're almost always in motion somewhere. We're in motion in space. We're almost in motion even ideologically. We change. You're different 10 years ago as you are now. You evolve, you move. Spiritual relationships, philosophical relationships, political relationships, whatever. But also even internally, we get to someplace that's quiet, but then we still want to escape even more. And we still keep pushing. It's almost how this idea where sort of stillness is death. The only body that doesn't move is a dead one. Everyone moves, even if you're a paraplegic, your chest actually moves because you're breathing, or you're actually moving. And so, or we're at whatever, whatever, you're something's moving there. And so we're almost always moving, whether it's actually in space or even in our mind or even in our spirit. And I think whether that motion is good or bad, that's depending on where you're moving. But I think that reflects almost an inherent human thing, that we're just constantly moving. We're almost restless in that way.
Yes, restless. Yes. OW, where can people find you on Twitter? Where can people find your Substack? People would love to know more about your work and what you do.
You can find me on Necktie Salvage on Twitter. And on Substack, you can, if you're interested in style, I write about style in the fitting room. That's on Substack. And I also write not about style, but just about life, modernity, and it's creative writing on Modern Lives on Substack as well. So I have 2 publications I write for on Substack. And like I said, Necktie Salvage on Twitter, X, whatever. Real people call it Twitter. Those of us,
It's Twitter.
It's Twitter.
It's Twitter.
That's how you can tell a new user versus an old user. It's Twitter. It's always,
1,000,000%.
exactly. You're always going to be Twitter. So either Fitting Room in Substack or Modern Lives on Substack.
Awesome. OW, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks for having me.